All right, in the studio right now is the district attorney in Oneida County, Scott McNamara. So I want to ask just a few more questions, and we'll let you. This could go on for hours.
Yes, it could.
Right? I mean, man, what a terrible. I mean, at the end of the day, what an awful, awful, terrible. And I'm sure you saw things that just you wish you never had seen or learned about. How does this kid go on from here?
You know, I don't know. I know he's now with a good family. I do think he's doing good. He's in a situation where he's introduced into society, normal society.
Yeah.
He's not isolated anymore. I know during the summertime he had a job, so things of that nature. I don't know. I know. When the first trial, when the trial took place with Sarah Ferguson, he still hadn't had any contact with his father. So I mean, and I think that's a difficult situation that he's in. I think he's still very upset.
Lost everything. I mean, think about the church, which was his life,
right.
and his parents,
and
gone.
And his parents whipped him really bad, and I don't think he's forgiven them for that. And obviously his sister whipped him really bad. And he lost his brother. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I will say this much. I from talking to him, he does have a fairly strong personality. He's tough. He's a tough kid. And he has come around quite a bit from the first time I met him in the hospital until, when he testified. So I hope he does well. I hope that, this cloud of that he's a molester. One of the things too that I didn't get to mention, but during the counseling session when they beat Luke and killed Luke, one of the things Luke was forced to confess to was that he raped and molested like every kid in around where he grew up. So we actually went to every single kid, the names of all these girls that he supposedly raped and molested, and they all said almost the same thing. No, that never happened. He has never touched me inappropriate. And Luke was a really nice guy. He wasn't like that. So, all these things that the kids were accused of doing, we disproved by interviewing them. Now, obviously, we couldn't drag in all 8 or 9 girls, or I forget now how many there exactly were that he admitted to, but they all, were saying the same thing, that no, Luke never touched me like that. And they almost were kind of like, why are you here? Because they didn't know that their name came up in the counseling session where ultimately
it was so interesting, though, from somebody that we were all watching what we could see very closely, but when he had made the admission on the stand, which I think the key thing here is what is molestation in this kid's head, what was drilled into his head, but it stopped right there, and we talked about that earlier. But that is so. But that would really, when you think of it, wouldn't have changed anything. I've heard stories of people who feared their kids were molested, and the attorneys coming out very sternly saying, "Do not take this into your own hands. You will then be the one sitting in jail."
Right. If they had done what they should have done when these allegations came up, and what they should have done was they should have called the police, and we would have investigated it, and we would have went back to the Sarah Ferguson and said, Sarah, there's no signs if you're, and we have medical doctors look at the children, interview the children. The people that interview the children are people that are trained specially to interview children. So there are certain, it isn't just like any police officer is going to interview a child in a sexual abuse case. They are specially trained police officers, and that's who we brought in. So, that's what would have happened. And to be honest with you, neither one of the kids would have gotten any trouble because there's no evidence. I mean, whether or not there were some things that they came up during the trial between the sister and the boys when they were younger. But once again, if you're doing things, and once again, unfortunately, but how many children play doctor with, their next door neighbor or whatever. And, and all that kind of stuff, whether that happened or not, it's a moot point. We know from videotape that Grace accused the boys of inappropriately touching her when she was young, and they were young. They were 4 years apart. 2 between, it was 2, basically when one was 5, the other was 7, the other was 9. Okay. and that was why Grace testified she moved upstairs with Sarah Ferguson. But she said that it had stopped years before.
Yeah.
And, you know, so it's the whole situation was spun way out of control. And I think Bruce Leonard, you know, started whipping them because he thought that's what
he was supposed to do.
Because he had been told that by Tiffany on many occasions that he wasn't being a good father because these boys were out of control and he couldn't control them. And so he did what he thought, you know, he was supposed to do because the Bible says. He actually told me that. He cited the verse in the Bible that basically it's the spare the rod, spoil the child verse.
Yeah. Wow.
Can I ask, you talked about trying to connect with Chris and say, you know, I don't think your pastor's actually, you know, has God's cell phone number type of a deal. Is there any evidence that the co-defendants have, since this incident, have seen maybe she had control over me and the
have
group?
Have they seen the light?
Yeah.
No, not at all. As a matter of fact,
not even the mother, because she was
at one point we did. I did think I had the mother. You know, in the early stages, I spent a lot of time with the mother. Her lawyer spent a lot of time. He actually spent a lot more time than I did. And she seemed to be acknowledging certain things that were really wrong. Like one of the things they do in that church is they publicly humiliate you during service. And another thing,
it's got to be a fun service.
Yeah, it's got to be great to go there. And the other thing is they would, there's church punishment. So, for example, one of the ways that the pastor would manipulate the boys was she would get the boys to confide in one of the other males in the church. So, for example, Luke would always talk to Joe, and we know that from Joe's phone because a lot of the conversations were text messages. And Chris would talk to David Morey, and they would confide in them. They would tell them things that most of us as adults wouldn't tell anybody, okay? So your inner thoughts, especially about girls, about just things that a lot of people do. Without getting into it. And that information would be then fed to the pastor, and then she would shame the boys in the middle of these 8-hour services, saying, you know, I know you're lusting, I know you think this or think that. And the problem with these groups, when they're very small like that and they're isolated, and these boys, in addition to being forced into isolation from the church, were also homeschooled. So their environment is a very limited group of people. So if they said, "Oh, geez, I find this person attractive," or I think Pastor Tiffany's pretty, then that's lusting, and lusting is a sin, and you're going to hell. And if you don't make it good with me, Pastor Tiffany, then it's not good with God, and you're going to hell. And it was just a terrible situation that they were in, and they really didn't appreciate what was happening to them. They were sharing their confidence. That would then be shared with her, and she would shame them. One of the forms of punishment.
Did they know? Did the boys know that someone was betraying them, or did they feel it was divine? That
she knew
she had a connection to God, so she was able to know this stuff.
I think they thought that it was divine. I think part of the problem is I think Luke. And this is speculation on my part because obviously Luke's dead and I never got to talk to him, and I don't think anyone ever talked to him about it. But one of the things that Luke did was Luke was blindly following Tiffany for about a year, the year before he died, and then up to a year before he died, and then it stopped. He stopped sending text messages. He stopped reporting his personal thoughts to Joe. He shut down. He didn't want any part of the church anymore. And as a matter of fact, in August, before he left, he actually went to a different church, which it would have been equivalent to cheating on your spouse with the pastor. And that was when things changed dramatically for him. He was punished in her way of punishing, which I think he had to write, something 1,000 times. He had to do it before 8 o'clock the next morning, so that meant he stayed up all night. One of the ways that she would punish him is to assign things like that, where you then create sleep deprivation. Another way that they punished the people was to force them to stand for hours. And in church services, we could see that because all the church services were recorded. So you would see the boys separated at church, and there was almost like what I would call the timeout box, where the boys had to sit. And then there would be times they were forced to stand. Actually, the night that Luke died, him and Christopher, after they were brutally whipped, they were forced to stand for hours. until Luke collapsed. So, and then Chris was still forced to stand.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
all these type of punishments that they inflicted, throughout the years caused these people to not only, it's kind of hard because I think initially they wanted to believe and then they were afraid not to believe.
Yeah.
If you cross them, then the punishment was pretty severe.
I want to end on this. There are a lot of victims here, more so than would be, and some victims have no choice, but they got to go to jail.
Right.
Do you see it that way, that there was one manipulator and a lot of victims that bought in, creating more victims?
Yes, I definitely see it that way. I personally think the entire Leonard family was a victim of the abuse and the mind control that the Irwin family perpetrated on them. But it's free will. I mean, I feel really bad for the father. I think Bruce Leonard is, and I've spoke to him many times. I mean, I've watched him cry. I've watched him break down uncontrollably, crying, admitting to what he, realizing that he killed or helped kill his own son. But he seems to be a genuinely good man that just blindly followed her because he wanted him and his family to go to heaven so bad. That he just followed her, but it's free choice. I mean, he could have, and I've told him that you should have said enough of this. We're going home. Nobody's whipping my children. We'll take care of this or whatever, but we don't whip our children.
Wow. Never seen anything like this,
and I hope I never do again.
DA Scott McNamara, thank you so much for taking the time. Got a break at WIBX.